Hello everyone, welcome to the module on the nervous system. In this module we will cover two important anatomical aspects of the nervous system, that is dural venous sinuses and the ventricular system of the nervous system. Okay, now starting with the dural venous sinus, it is a large venous channel that runs through the periosteal and the meningeal layers of the dura mater. Okay, so these are venous channels that run in the dura mater. Is this clear? And hence it is called as dural venous sinuses. Now these drain blood from the cerebral veins and receive CSF from the arachnoid granulation. Okay, so it drains blood from the cerebral veins and receives the cerebrospinal fluid from the arachnoid granulation, and these drain entirely into the internal jugular vein. Is this clear? So drains blood from the cerebral vein and receives CSF from the arachnoid granulation and drains the entire blood into the internal jugular vein. Now the venous thrombosis or the venous sinus thrombosis presents with the signs and symptoms of increase in the intracranial pressure. Okay, because of the thrombosis in this dural venous sinuses, there is an increase in the intracranial pressure which leads to headache, seizures, papilledema, focal neurologic deficits, and etc. Okay, now these may also lead to venous hemorrhage if there is a rupture, and these are associated with extreme or hypercoagulable states like pregnancy, OCP use, or oral contraceptive pill use, and factor V Leiden. Is this clear? So these are the symptoms or signs of venous sinus thrombosis. Now let me explain you the entire connection. The superior sagittal sinus, this is the superior sagittal sinus, drains into the confluence of sinuses with the straight sinus. Is this clear? So the superior sagittal sinus with the straight sinus drains into the confluence of sinuses. Now, how is the straight sinus formed? It is formed by the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein of the Galen. Okay, so it is formed by inferior sagittal vein or inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein of Galen. So these two combine to form the straight sinus. Straight sinus joins the superior sagittal sinus at the confluence of sinuses and forms a transverse sinus. Now this transverse sinus then further forms the sigmoid sinus, which passes through the jugular foramen and forms the internal jugular vein. Is this clear? Now at the confluence of sinuses, there is also one more sinus, which is occipital sinus, that drains into the confluence of sinuses, forming the transverse sinus. So we spoke about the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, great cerebral vein, straight sinus, confluence of sinus, occipital sinus, the transverse sinus, which forms a sigmoid, further passing through the jugular vein and then forming the internal jugular vein. Is this clear? Now remember that the superior sagittal sinus is the main location of the cerebrospinal return from the arachnoid granulation. Is this clear? And this is the image seen by the brain. This is the different sinus. This is a superior sagittal sinus. This is the sigmoid sinus, etc. Okay? This is the great cerebral vein. So this is all about the dural venous sinuses. Okay. Now let us talk about the ventricular system. Now the ventricular system, there are four major ventricles: the two lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Okay. So first let me show you the two lateral ventricles. The structures in pink that I'm highlighting right now, these two structures are the two lateral ventricles. Okay, the lateral ventricles have an anterior horn, they have a posterior horn and an inferior horn. Is this clear? So they have an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and an inferior horn. Now remember that the third ventricle via the right and the left interventricular foramen of Monroe joins the lateral ventricle. That means the cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricle goes through the interventricular foramina of Monroe. Let me just zoom into this diagram. Okay, so these are the two lateral ventricles. From the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramina of Monroe, the cerebrospinal fluid moves into the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle. This is the foramen. Okay, so this is the third ventricle. Now, from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, this is the cerebral aqueduct, it moves into the fourth ventricle. Am I clear? Now, from the fourth ventricle, there are two more foramens, that is the foramen of Magendie and the foramen of Luchuska, that is the lateral aperture and the medial aperture. Remember M for medial or Magendie for medial and Luchuska or L for lateral. Is this clear? So, there are two lateral ventricles, third ventricle and fourth ventricle. From the lateral to the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina of Monroe, from the third to the fourth via the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Is this clear? Now, the fourth ventricle, there is the cerebrospinal fluid moves to the lateral aspect through the subarachnoid space via the foramina of Luchuska and Magendie. So, remember L for lateral and M for medial. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid made by the choroid plexus is located in the lateral and the fourth ventricle, which travels to the subarachnoid space via the foramina of Luchuska and the Magendie and is reabsorbed. Please remember that this is reabsorbed by the arachnoid granulation, as I discussed in the dural venous sinuses, and drains into the dural venous sinuses. Is this clear? So, these are reabsorbed by the arachnoid granulation, and the important and the most high topic of dural venous sinus that I have discussed is superior sagittal sinus, okay, which brings about maximum CSF via the arachnoid granulation. Is this clear? So, these are the structures of ventricular system. So, we have covered dural venous sinuses and its different parts and ventricular system of the brain. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, please click on the like button and do subscribe to this channel. Let me know in the comment section below which topics do you want me to explain. Thank you.